Okay, so making points, a little bit of structure. So in terms of how to actually make a point, here is the structure that we recommend. It's called CEO, Context, Explanation, Outcomes. So the first thing that you want to do with a point is it needs a title. So you need to say, my next point is this. Then you want to explain the context. What do I need to know about the world to understand this point? That's, if you were doing a debate about education, about banning uniforms in schools, you say a large number of schools in New Zealand have really strict uniform codes that stop people from having certain haircuts, wearing certain clothes, even having different kinds of socks. That's the context that I need to know for the point. Explanation. So if we do the thing that you support, right, if we take the action in your model, what happens? Why does that happen? What happens next? Why does that happen? What happens after that? Why does that happen? So what, then why? That's how you work through logical reasoning in debating. What happens? Why does that happen? Then what's the next step? Why is that next step? What happens next? This is where you can add in examples, you can add in anything that you like, but you're trying to go from point A, which is the context right now, to point Z, which is the outcome, and that's the last thing. So what happens at the end? What's the result? The impact, the outcome that affects people, and why does that matter? So that's the same as when we were thinking in prep about problem, model, solution, outcomes. That's this outcomes section here. So for example, if your point, the whole debate is about banning uniforms, the point is that it's a waste of teachers' time to have to be regulating uniform codes, right? So maybe the context is there's heaps of silly rules, teachers have to spend heaps of time on it. Explanation, if we banned uniforms, so starting with what's the thing you're going to do, if we banned school uniforms, teachers would no longer have to spend heaps of time on silly rules because there would be no rules to implement. What happens next? That means that they would have time to focus on other things because there's not as much pressure on their time. They would focus on things like student learning. Why? Because teachers care about student learning and that's what schools should be focused on. Why? Because schools are for learning. That would mean outcome. The outcome of that is that students would have more resources or students would have more teacher time focused on student learning. That would improve students' educational outcomes because having time from teachers is really important for student learning. So hopefully that makes sense. You start with the world as it is, then you introduce what's the thing you're going to change, and you talk me through all the steps until you get to the final outcome. One thing to know is that you don't have to write your points in this order. So if you think of the outcome first, that's perfectly fine. In fact, most people think of outcomes first and then you backfill the context and then you talk from context to outcome. You don't have to write it in a stream of consciousness. You can write things the way that you want to write them, but this is the way that we would recommend that you explain them because it's the way that makes the most kind of A to Z sense. Okay, and then I see that I did not read these slides properly and I'm going to talk you through each of those things again. I would note here, again, the explanation is you want to have a lot of why statements will be cause statements. That's the same thing. And then outcomes, and thing to know again about outcomes is really important to explain why that outcome matters. Why is it important? Why do I care more about student learning in terms of education than I care about students maybe learning about how to present themselves in an appropriate way for a work environment or something like that. Whatever the other team's arguments are, why is what you're saying more important? And it can seem really obvious. You can be like, well, obviously education is important, Ailey. Why would you even ask me to explain that? But making those explanations is what makes the points really strong. And in a debate, it's only the things that you say that matter, not the things that you assume that everybody else already knows. Okay, so here's an example. I already talked you through an example and we're a little bit short on time. So I won't go through that example with you again, but I'll share these slides on our website and you can have a look at them later. Yeah, and then one of these tips that I would highlight is if you can ask your teammates to help you, and yeah, make sure that you have a note-taking system for points that is really easy to follow. So I would recommend that each point has its own piece of paper. We have the title at the beginning, you write context, explanation, outcome on the piece of paper, a third of the way down each, and then you write the notes. And if there's 2 reasons why something is true, put a little 1 and then a little 2 and write like that with numbering or bullet points. You don't have to write notes word for word. In fact, it's often helpful to just make notes rather than a transcript of a point. But if you prefer to write in a different way, that's fine. You just want to make sure that it's really visually easy for you when you're standing up to speak to differentiate between the first point and the second point. And it's really easy for a judge to follow what you're saying as you move along. Because remember, the judge wasn't with you in the prep room or all of the time that you spent writing the point. So it's not as obvious to them when you're moving on to something different as it is to you.